Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here on a Monday morning, talking about sustainability. It's a good start for the week, and so I welcome you all to the sustainability seminar series that we organize at IIT Gandhinagar. And this is part of Kiransi Patel Center for Sustainable Development. The objective of this series is to invite scholars, prominent scholars from different fields, professionals who are working for the environment, sustainable development. And we have been organizing this series, and we have had wonderful speakers and sessions. And today, again, I'm very privileged and honor to introduce and welcome the speaker of the series, Dr. Sejal Vora. Very interesting topic. I shall be talking about conservation at scale. What have we learned? And Dr. Vora has had over 25 years of experience in the field of conservation and sustainable development. She's currently the program director at WWF in India, and she manages an interdisciplinary team working on diverse issues ranging from landscape conservation to climate change, river basin management, and also indigenous rights. Her primary area of interest is the very interesting interface between economic development and nature conservation, natural resources conservation. And over her career, she has worked with a number of international and regional organizations, including some of them are UNDP, FAO, CARE, and IC Board. And she has been on advisory boards and committees in India and internationally. Largely, she has worked in over 20 countries in South and Southeast Asia. She is also co-founder and director of a private nature reserve in Uttarakhand, which focuses on forest restoration and is designed to demonstrate the links between conservation, sustainable tourism, and local livelihood development. And thank you so much, Dr. Bora, for agreeing to come and give this talk. And you have around 30 to 35 minutes. And Falguni, you will be telling when to stop, right? And after that, we'll take a Q&A. So
Yeah.
thank you so much, Dr. Vora. Over to you.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here, and thanks for inviting me. I'll just start by sharing my screen and then talk you through the presentation. Okay, so I was described as a scholar. I don't actually see myself as a scholar. I see myself more as a practitioner. What I'm going to share with you today is really my own learning journey because I've been in this field now for almost my entire life. I would say my entire professional life, and a lot has changed from the time that I started working in the conservation sector to today. In this rapidly changing world, it's really important to sort of look back and say, what have we learned, and where do we go from here? So I'm going to share with you my own learning journey and some examples of how we actually deal with this dilemma, of conservation and development, particularly in the Indian context. And then would be happy to have a discussion with you because these are really my thoughts in a way that I'm sharing with you. So just WWF releases something called the Living Planet Report every year, which tells us about the state of our living environment. The 2020 report was telling in just giving some very stark reminders of where we are today as a planet and what is humanity's impact on the planet. So we need to keep this in mind as we go along. Is that in a way, if you want to look at it very starkly, our relationship with nature is at breaking point. And things like COVID and pandemics, the disasters that we've seen last year, the fires, the floods, globally, we've seen this huge impact. But it seems that despite all this, it's still, we've had this wake up call, but I think we have still to really seriously take consideration of what this means for us and our future. This is, this is to me a very telling picture of how we are squeezing the green lungs of our planet. This is the city of Delhi, and what you see is the remainders of the Delhi Ridge, and you can see how urbanization is just creeping along, and as I said, squeezing these green lungs of our planet, and this picture is telling. It's also telling that from the development scenario, we still are looking at these kinds of places, forests and other areas as a block to development rather than as something that is going to help us in our own sustainable future. And again, just from the India side, if you look at some of these figures and statistics, you realize that we still have a long way to go until we actually realize that conservation is as important as development going forward, that development without conservation is going to cause us a crisis. But these are very recent sort of figures which show you that even in the last 6 months, January to June, in 6 months, we diverted nearly 10,000 hectares of forest land. And this is going on, at pace. So I'll take you through with that introduction, I'll just take you through the landscape journey. So as WWF, we have these priority landscapes that you see spread out across the country. And what we mean by a landscape is a large geographical area, which we look at in terms of sustainable development and conservation. So these are not protected areas. These are not strictly protected. These are large areas where we look at how can we reconcile conservation and sustainable development. And as you can see, these are quite large areas. If you look at the Tarayak landscape, we're talking about 45,000 square kilometers. Obviously, this is not just forest. This is a mosaic and interspersion of all kinds of different human use activities. And the challenge that we want to talk about is how do we make these human activities more in tune with conservation so that we can have a long-term sustainable future for people and the wildlife living in these landscapes. So I'll start with what, the visual impression of what a landscape looks like. So when I started my journey, this is actually a place where I did my PhD work. And this was to me, what a landscape would look like. It would be interspersed forests, there would be agriculture, there would be human settlements, but fairly, smallish villages. And we would try and reconcile how do we actually create a landscape of the future in places like this, where you could have forests, people, agriculture, and other livelihoods all playing out with each other. But actually, what the reality is that this is what a landscape looks like today. And this is also within one of our landscapes. And we have to actually deal with this kind of development and not necessarily just what we might think of as an idyllic small village kind of landscape. But this is the landscapes that we have to find a way to deal with. Similarly, this was my idea of a forest corridor as well, because if you look here, you can see that there are forest patches which are interconnected by a riverine landscape, by agriculture, small settlements. There is a city in the background as well. But these kinds of mosaics are quite conducive in a way for wildlife and for species to move around because they can negotiate their way through these kinds of corridors. However, this very same corridor, if you look at it 5 years down the road, this is what it looks like. So land use change is incredibly rapid and happening, almost literally before our eyes as we speak. And many of these corridors are now getting more and more fragmented so that we are ending up with small patches of forest which are isolated from each other and which are not entirely sustainable from a conservation point of view. Again, if you look at industrialization, and this is again an interesting picture which shows the Rajaji National Park in Uttarakhand and the area that was designated for an industrial estate. And if you look at it today, this is how hard the edge is. So you look at this edge of the forest and a whole industrial estate there, and a huge impact on water resources here because you see the rivers coming out and the kind of water consumption that these industries have huge impacts both on agriculture and on the forest in terms of water quantity, but also the quality of the water because of the pollution impacts. So you start seeing these very, very close interactions between industry and conservation landscapes as well. When you think about agriculture, again, when we started working on agriculture, we worked very much with subsistence farmers. And we looked at, how do we help to make farming, more sustainable? How do we help to make farming more economically viable? And how do we work with small-scale subsistence farmers to improve their livelihoods and farming practices? But increasingly, when you look at farming today, it's commercial. This is cotton, which is grown, in large parts of the country. And as you know, cotton is a very, very high impact crop because 50% of the pesticide in India is used on this one crop. And also very, very huge water consumption. So we've got to start thinking about how do we work with agriculture at scale and not just with small farmers, but also with commercial farmers and with supply chains if we want to make these areas sustainable. Roads, this is another feature that everybody in India has seen dramatically changing. These are the roads that we used to travel on when we were doing our field work. And quite often you would see wildlife crossing the roads. These roads are fairly easy for wildlife to cross. Not particularly safe, but it is possible for wildlife to use these kinds of landscapes and cross these kinds of roads. The roads of today and tomorrow are going to be like this. And while nobody denies that we need better roads and we need better infrastructure, huge impacts of these kinds of roads on landscapes in terms of cutting corridor connectivity, and also in terms of mortality on roads like this. So this is something that we have to also learn how to live with, deal with, and find solutions for. Resource use, again, increasingly we used to work with rural communities a lot to look at how do we make resource use more sustainable, what kinds of technologies can we provide, what kinds of alternatives can we provide, and spent a lot of time working out these kinds of alternatives. Increasingly, though, what we're seeing is that a lot of use of resources is not just subsistence, but it's commercial. And it's much harder to tackle commercial use of resources. But unless we do so, we are not going to solve the problem. So we need to think about the vast amounts of firewood being used in the commercial sector and the tourism sector. And this is something that people find very difficult to deal with and to find solutions for. So what do we have? If you look at, this is a Central India landscape, a map of the Central India landscape where we work. The landscape is generally a mosaic of protected areas, forest areas, connecting corridors, and all other kinds of land use that is going on here. And you find that these landscapes are increasingly being impacted by all kinds of things. So extractives, mining is a big issue in Central India. Roads and railways obviously coming up at a fast pace. Industrialization, urbanization, agriculture expansion, water infrastructure that is coming in, and of course, energy and resources, both in terms of mining and other areas. So if you look at the landscapes, it's really, lots of big challenges to deal with. And how do you then find solutions for all these challenges, which are much larger than just, rural communities using resources, which is what we used to tend to focus on. Now we're focusing much more on these bigger picture issues and the drivers, as we call it, of biodiversity loss, rather than just looking at the symptoms. But there are also opportunities. So along with challenges come opportunities. And, for a long time, and many of you will recall this, and this is still, the kind of community interactions that we have, doing the PRA exercises, looking at resource mapping, working with communities on the ground. Increasingly, though, what is happening is that communities are much better connected. And everywhere you go, even in the remotest part of India, you'll find people have smartphones. They know how to use these smartphones, and we can very, very effectively use this kind of technology for conservation and for rural development as well. Similarly, there was a typical picture of, village community sitting on the ground, people from outside coming in and sort of telling them what to do, having these kinds of community meetings. There was in a way, a very, very big difference in power in terms of how these meetings were played out. But again, increasingly, you find much more empowered communities. You find communities who are much more aware, more vocal. This is a meeting that is being held, a public hearing that is being held for a World Bank hydropower project in Himachal Pradesh. And here, this particular meeting, I recall very well, the community decided to just walk out. They took on the World Bank and they decided that they didn't want to have this project. And so you have much more empowered communities with whom you can talk and engage and negotiate much more equally. So this is a good development that has happened and a good sign. Similarly, technology, again, many of you will also know that for years and years, we worked on various kinds of technology, including, I don't know how many different types of chulas, different kinds of fuel efficient chulas, trying to get, use of firewood made more efficient. We worked on biogas for a long time, and all of these technologies which we were introducing into rural areas. But increasingly, rural people are leapfrogging technology. So just like they leapfrog with mobile phones, I remember women in Uttarakhand kind of, when we were going there to talk about biogas and introducing biogas, saying, well, actually what we want is we want the same cooking gas that you use. Why should we be going around, with firewood and biogas? We also want to use LPG. And increasingly you see that, LPG is being used far and wide across the country. So many rural communities are moving on in terms of leapfrogging technology. Let's look at this challenge of infrastructure. And these maps are telling in themselves in terms of just the kind of linear infrastructure that is developing in this country. And this is still, the start. There is a long way to go, and there are huge ambitious programs in terms of increasing both the length of highways and also the width, and upgrading a lot of highways. So the impacts of linear infrastructure are going to be tremendous going forward. And this is again another important fact to remember, that we only have 5% of protected areas in the country, but almost all of these have linear infrastructure passing through them, and this is only going to increase. And we know, as I mentioned to you earlier, the impacts of linear infrastructure are tremendous. Train hits and elephants. This is a very tragic story in India. Increasingly, we're also finding, road hits. And just last week, another tiger was, a male tiger was killed in Uttarakhand in a road accident. So this is becoming increasingly common. What is the solution? Can we find a way forward? We spent a lot of time talking to the Railways Ministry and trying to figure out how do we deal with this issue of elephants and railway tracks. And for a long time, there was a lot of resistance, because India really needs to upgrade its railway infrastructure. And there was resistance to the idea of slowing down trains. There was resistance to the idea of, realigning tracks. But very, very happily, and I think a fairly recent development was that we've had a very, very good interaction with the railways in the Northeast, who have actually been extremely receptive. Nobody likes killing elephants. Neither do the railways like the fact that elephants are becoming increasingly an issue in the railway lines. So everyone is looking for a solution, really, but a holistic solution needs to be found, not a piecemeal, one by one. Let's do something here, let's do something there, but we need to look at the big picture. And right now we are in a dialogue with the Northeast Railway to look at the whole picture of what is going on in the Northeast. We know elephant behavior. We know sections where the hits happen. Can we come up with an overall comprehensive plan with the railways, and using smart technology and training to ensure that we actually minimize and completely eliminate elephant deaths on railway tracks? So this is something that is going on, and I can go into details of it, but for those of you interested, but it is actually looking at a combination of technology, design, training, animal behavior, and combining all of this to come up with a model that will reduce train hits. So that's one good development. On roads, lots of things have been happening. Guidelines have been issued on how roads should be developed through forest areas. There are some prototypes that are being done in various places. This is the famous NH7 that goes between Kanha and Pench wildlife sanctuaries. A lot of back and forth in terms of design, what should be done, the cost implications. The main issue with this is cost, really, because if you really wanted to have a scientifically designed highway going through a forest area, it does have serious cost implications. So a lot of back and forth and negotiation keeps happening between the developers, the government, the scientists, and in the end, you end up with a compromise which may or may not work. But at least it's a start. At least that there are now guidelines issued. There is a genuine attempt at ensuring that some kind of road design and smarter roads are being built. And this is how this road looks like. This is a 750-meter underpass that has been made on this highway NH7. And the jury is out to see how effective these are. How many of these do we need? What's the best design? But as I said, at least a start has been made, and tigers and other wildlife have been seen using these underpasses. So it's a big step forward, but a long way to go in terms of really getting it right. Human-wildlife conflict. This is of course a big issue, and as more development, more forests getting squeezed, more interface between humans and their livestock and wildlife, conflict is only going to increase. And we see large areas in India where there is this enormous conflict. And unless we resolve this, there's going to be very little support for conservation, at least from rural and local communities, because they still see themselves paying the price of conservation, while the benefits are actually going somewhere else. So we need to ensure that rural communities don't actually pay the price for conservation. And just in terms of the impacts, it's massive. To give you an example, along the southern periphery of Corbett National Park, where we work on human-wildlife conflict, in a year, just on that part, and that's only a small part of the park, there's more than 1,000 cattle killed every year by carnivores. And obviously, this is a huge loss for people to bear, especially poor people who don't have large numbers of livestock. So what can we do about it? Similarly, also I should say that elephants are an equal problem in many rural areas in terms of crop damage and the amount of losses that people suffer from elephant crop damage. So one, of course, is smarter technology. And we keep on upgrading and trying to test new areas and new ideas in terms of what is the technology that we can use to keep people and wildlife safe in these areas of interaction. Elephants are incredibly smart. They figure out, their way around most kinds of technology. You have to be one step ahead of them and they'll always catch up. But again, you need a combination of methods. Only one method is not going to work. These two examples are examples of technology that are being tested out to deter elephants. On the left-hand side is a new type of fence, which is a hanging fence, because elephants have figured out how to negotiate the normal solar fences quite well. So the technology and the design has to keep evolving, because as I said, elephants are quite smart and they figure their way out. On the right-hand side is something called aniders, which is another technology that we're testing, which is a technology which gives out kind of a signal to communities when elephants are coming close by, so they can mobilize themselves in advance rather than being taken by surprise. Similarly, with livestock, for a long time, one of the things that we used to do is provide an ex gratia payment for livestock that were killed. And so, for example, every time a livestock is killed, there is a government scheme that provides compensation for the livestock. But generally what happens, it's a very convoluted process. It takes a long time. And the villagers whose cow has been killed is obviously very upset and wants immediate redressal, which they often don't get. And as a result of it, there's sometimes retaliation. So for almost 20 years, we've been running a scheme where we would immediately, within 24 hours, provide an ex gratia payment and then help the community to get the compensation, just so that immediate frustration and the immediate anger is quelled, and they realize that they will get some compensation. Over the years, we recognized that while this was working to some extent, it also was not an incentive for people to change their behavior in terms of how livestock are managed and treated, and also the sustainability of the scheme. That there was need for something much more sustainable and long term. So we've been working with communities on a cattle insurance scheme, and this is a couple of villages where we've prototyped this, where the village actually insures its cattle as a community. And this insurance then makes sure that if anything happens to the cattle, if it is killed by a carnivore, or even if it gets diseased, they get insurance right away. And this also incentivizes behavior, because they look after their cattle much better. There are also certain conditions in the insurance which says that this is what you need to do, and that's how you need to manage your cattle, and then you will get the insurance. So it actually is a small step towards behavioral change, and also helping the community with something that is much more sustainable and long term. So the idea here is that we need to manage this issue of conflict in multiple ways, and we also need to think about how do we ensure that the conflict is also minimized and managed by the communities themselves, with the support of ourselves, NGOs and the state. The other thing that we also recognize, of course, is that economic incentives are very important for conservation. It's not the only incentive, but it's an important incentive. And tourism, as you all know, is a key incentive in many places, which gets communities directly linked with conservation. This is a small project that we've been doing in Arunachal Pradesh, and very interesting spin-offs of these projects, which I just want to share with you. So this is a community-run project where the community has its own conservation area. As you know, in Arunachal, there are many forests which are owned de facto by communities. So this community has set up a conservation area of their own of about 300 square kilometers. And it's very rich in birds and pheasants. So tourists come there to sort of experience that forest, and the community manages it entirely themselves. So they get the fee from the tourists, plus they've set up a whole bunch of other schemes where they can also get benefits from tourism. So there's a very, very direct link between the community benefits, the tourism, and the conservation area. As a result of which, they've completely taken ownership of this conservation area as well. And this group that you see is a group of youth from the village who have set up their own rules and regulations for conservation. They patrol the area regularly. They fine people if they find them carrying out what they consider as illegal activities. And they are very, very strict about this. And not only are they strict with their own communities and partner communities, but they've also managed to catch people going there for bioprospecting, foreigners that they've caught in terms of collecting things like beetles and butterflies. So they've become very cognizant of the value and the conservation value of their area as a result of looking at how it benefits them very, very directly. And as I said, the economic benefits are not the only benefits from conservation. It's very important to look at empowerment. And empowered communities will also act for conservation. This is, and as you know, the Forest Rights Act provides now for that provision of handing over forests to communities and empowering them to manage and use them. This is in Kerala, where we worked with the Kadar community in the Varachal Forest Division to actually get 600 square kilometers of forest handed over back to the communities. And it's a long process. It took 7 years, which is actually in itself a problem if it takes so long. But the communities mapped out the forest, mapped out their conservation areas, looked at overlapping claims. It took a long, long time. And on the bottom left, you see the claims and the title being handed over to the community. Once again, a very, very important step in the future of conservation in India is these empowered communities who will eventually be responsible for not just using the forest, but also for managing it. And here you see the Kadars actually putting up camera traps in their forest to look at the movement of wildlife and tigers and to monitor the movement of wildlife and tigers. So again, empowerment as a very, very big incentive for conservation. Let's look for a second at agriculture, and this is looking at the bigger picture. So a lot of the previous work that I mentioned was local, but we can also look at how do we bring in supply chains and global networks to incentivize conservation. So here we are working in Madhya Pradesh in Chhindwara district on promoting organic cotton, and the idea here being that if farmers get a return from more sustainably grown crops and more sustainably grown agriculture, then it will act as an incentive for sustainability and therefore also act as an incentive for conservation, because these agricultural areas are in critical wildlife corridors. So maintaining and enhancing agricultural productivity and returns here while promoting sustainability, that's the answer. So here is organic cotton being grown in Chhindwara. Sorry. And basically these cooperatives have been set up where the communities themselves have set up marketing cooperatives. And through these marketing cooperatives, it's a long story and quite convoluted, but I'm cutting it very, very short. This organic cotton is being procured directly by a Danish company called Neutral. And they pay them up to a 30% premium for this cotton. So they're getting a much, much higher price and at the same time, lower input costs and much better for the environment. And this company then converts this organic cotton into t-shirts and sells them to a national park in Sweden. And the returns are coming then directly back to the community. So you actually have a global supply chain, which is also conservation linked, coming back to support conservation in an area which is also very critical, which is this corridor between Satpura and Pench Tiger Reserve. So people are actually paying a premium both for the cotton and for the story of where this cotton is coming from. And these t-shirts are actually marketed as tiger t-shirts. So the idea being, ensuring that sustainability pays. And then finally, I'll just end with another big area of work. And sorry, I'm taking you through a very fast journey of how you work on these multiple and complex issues on the ground, is looking at urbanization. And when you look at urbanization in India, these pictures are probably the story of most cities in the country, where there has been a massive growth in urbanization. What makes Dehradun more significant is that this is supposed to be it's a special zone. So Dehradun is one of the ecologically sensitive areas identified in the country. And if this is what is happening in an identified ecologically sensitive area, you can just imagine what is going on with urbanization in areas which are not ecologically sensitive. And so we started analyzing this whole issue of urbanization and trying to see what is the entry point. How can we work on making urbanization a little more planned, a little more sustainable, and reducing the impact of urbanization on natural areas. So we started looking at this urban planning process. And again, this was quite telling. So this is what Dehradun's existing master plan looks like. And the red is the built up area, and the green obviously is the natural areas. This is the proposed master plan that Dehradun city is trying to get passed. But if you look at what the current situation is, this is what it actually looks like. So these master plans have no meaning anymore because the city has completely grown way beyond anything without any kind of plan, basically, essentially. So what do you do in a situation like this? How do you retrofit? How do you ensure that this doesn't continue? That is the challenge in front of us as India, rapidly urbanizes, one of the fastest urbanizing countries in the world today. So what we've been trying to do is work on 3 scales on urbanization. So we're working at the landscape level, where we're looking at major cities in the landscape, and then trying to engage with the city development authorities, town and country planning, and other departments to see how we can actually influence the growth of some of these cities. We're also looking at a regional level, and here it's quite interesting because there is a regional development plan also, particularly in this area. And if you can influence a regional development plan, then you can also influence the urbanization plan. And then finally, we're working directly with city authorities to look at planning within the city. And this has been one of our most successful interventions, I must say, with the Rishikesh master plan, where we've been able to actually influence the master plan to look at how growth should or should not happen, along riverfronts, along critical corridors, and it has actually been incorporated into the city master plan. And again, what was telling to us here was when we started engaging with the city authorities, they actually said, nobody told us. So, for example, when they're putting a huge bus depot in the middle of an elephant corridor, and we pointed it out, the feedback was that why didn't anybody tell us? Because we would have not done this, or we would have changed it, or we would have found an alternative if we'd known. So what it often comes down to is lack of knowledge and lack of capacity. And we found that actually engaging in a proactive and a positive way often has better impacts than just all the time challenging or confronting. So there are different ways in which you can influence the development trajectory, depending on what kind of entry point you can find. And then I just want to finally say that at the end of the day, what happens is that economics often is the driving factor in decision making. So if you can actually show the economics, and you can show the economic value, both immediate and long term, of natural resources and of conservation, then you can get the attention of the decision makers and policymakers often. So we spent quite a lot of time trying to make these economic arguments, to try and find how can we make this valid argument about the economics of conservation, so that at least enlightened policymakers will look at the longer term. Although, as you all know, it's difficult to get people to think long term. Everyone's thinking short term. But whether it is on rivers, whether it is on forests, whether it is on wetlands, we have been trying hard to make this economic case to say that actually the costs of losing these areas are going to be much higher than the benefits of the short-term benefits. And this has become increasingly important, particularly for wetlands, because we've seen with the floods in Chennai, Bangalore, etc., a lot of it exacerbated because of the loss of wetlands, and the cost has been enormous. So how can we actually reduce these costs by better management of our natural resources? And then finally, I just want to end by saying that at the end of the day, all of this is good, and there are many solutions. But citizen engagement and getting out of the apathy that I often see of people not wanting to get involved is also a key factor. And I think it's very, very important that as citizens of this country also, we demand better action on conservation and on sustainability. Otherwise, it's going to be a challenge going forward. So I'll end with that, and thank you for listening, and look forward to a good discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. For a fascinating talk. I think you actually took us to the entire country, from Kerala to Arunachal to Assam and Central India, to actually look at the issues on the ground. The challenge that we read in textbooks about environmental issues, conservation, you actually, through this very powerful images of, aerial pictures of this linear projects and, pictures from below. It's very overwhelming also to see the kind of issues that we are dealing with, and also very heartening to see the solutions of this underpass where the tiger is crossing.